Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first Sir John Monash lecture. So I'll hand over the mic to Professor Kumaran to moderate the event.
Right. Good evening and welcome to the first lecture of the 2019 Sir John Monash Distinguished Public Lecture series. So this Sir John Monash Public Lecture series provides Monash University, Malaysia with an opportunity to engage the community in Malaysia and the region through the promotion of thought leadership in key areas that are strategic to the development of the region in the 21st century. This lecture series takes inspiration from Sir John Monash, who is considered to be one of Australia's most distinguished citizen, scholar, leader, and a man who sought to use his education and abilities to the benefit of the community. This public lecture series covers a variety of contemporary and interdisciplinary topics that will be presented by high-profile thinkers, international leaders, policymakers, and corporate leaders and leading scholars who are distinguished in their areas of expertise and whose work have made significant impact to the global community. Today, we are delighted to have Associate Professor Tilman Ruff from the Nobel Institute for Global Health, University of Melbourne, who will present the first Sir John Monash public lecture for the year with the topic entitled The Humanitarian Imperative to Eradicate Nuclear Weapons. Dr. Ruff is co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, and is co-founder and founding chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. I quote, for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and for the groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. Dr. Ruff was the inaugural head of travel medicine at Fairfield Hospital and then Royal Melbourne Hospital. He currently serves as the World Health Organization's Western Pacific Hepatitis B Expert Resource Panel. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ruff.
Thanks very much, Professor Kumaran, and thank you to Monash for the honour of this invitation. I was a Monash graduate, so I'm particularly pleased to be here, and it's a rather auspicious day in Australia too, because it's the national holiday for Anzac Day, which is a commemoration of a ill-fated, ill-conceived, stupid military misadventure where many thousands of young Australians were sacrificed for no good reason in the First World War. I'm also delighted to be here to pay tribute to this man, and I'm particularly delighted that he's in the audience tonight, Dr. Ron McCoy, because not only is Dr. Ron McCoy one of Malaysia's most distinguished obstetricians, and the longest serving co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War that we've ever had. But he's also the father, the inspirer of ICAN. So I'm particularly honoured to be able to pay tribute to you, Ron, here. Of the many prophetic things that Albert Einstein said, there are two that particularly repeatedly resonate with me, and particularly in a university context. The duty to act that comes with the privilege to know. And his prophetic statement about just how much harnessing the power of the atom has changed our world in ways that we yet have to comprehend, and our governance systems are still inadequate to manage. What I'd like to do is to review for you the consequences of nuclear weapons use, the growing danger of nuclear war, and then where we are in the Herculean task of getting rid of these worst of all weapons. I'm going to talk about climate change quite a bit in a way that perhaps you're not used to thinking about, because nuclear weapons are actually the most acute threat to our global climate. First, a few numbers. It's hard to get your head around the destructive capacity of nuclear weapons. There are single nuclear weapons that have been built and tested that have several times more explosive power than all of the explosions that have been used in all wars throughout human history in a single weapon. Happily, the numbers have reduced from just over 70,000 to now 14,500. Unfortunately, that doesn't make us really any safer. Most of those are in the hands of Russia and the United States still. About 4,000 are deployed at any one time, and about half of those, almost 2,000, are ready to go at a few minutes' notice. Their average size at 200,000 tonnes of high explosive equivalent is about 13 times the size of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. There are still megaton range warheads deployed, most particularly on Chinese forces up to 5 million tonnes of high explosive equivalent. So just a graphic description just to appreciate that most of the problem is still with Russia and the United States, and the rest of the 7 other nuclear-armed states have about 1,000 nuclear weapons between them. To get a sense of the power of that arsenal still after being reduced by over 80%, if one Hiroshima-sized bomb were dropped every 2 hours since the end of 1945, you would not have finished yet to reach the destructive force in the current arsenal. Of course, the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima and then Nagasaki a few days later were by today's standards relatively small-sized tactical nuclear weapons. This is where the medical university in Nagasaki once stood. All of the students and faculty there were killed that day. Health services are disproportionately concentrated in urban centres, and even with one relatively small tactical weapon in Hiroshima, health services were essentially unable to function. There were very few personnel or facilities that were still functioning to deal with vast numbers of victims, many of whom had complex combinations of traumatic, burn and radiation injuries, very difficult and demanding to treat, even in the best of circumstances. The account of Dr. Marcel Junot, the Red Cross doctor who was the first international humanitarian worker on the scene, recently republished by the International Committee of the Red Cross, I think should be compulsory reading for all citizens of the 21st century. It's still chilling in its description of the scale of the devastation, and at that stage, of course, they had no idea why people who were apparently recovering then succumbed with bleeding and infection. Cities have changed, have become more fuel and population dense. A Hiroshima-sized bomb on a modern city like Mumbai would produce casualties not in the 100,000 order, but about an order of magnitude higher. Of course, there are large-scale, uncontainable global effects of continental scale in terms of the electromagnetic pulse of high-altitude explosions that would disrupt everything electrical and electronic on a continental scale. And of course, the radiation that spreads without respecting borders or any other barriers that we construct. Just to demonstrate the point, I'm showing you a couple of maps of the fallout from British nuclear tests in Australia that essentially blanketed the whole continent and clearly beyond as well. So the World Health Organization, when it examined the effects of nuclear war on health and health services in 2 landmark reports in the 1980s, unequivocally concluded that nuclear weapons constitute the greatest immediate threat to human health and welfare. They made it clear that no health service anywhere in the world or combination of them was up to responding to, in any adequate way, to the aftermath of even a single nuclear detonation over a city. and therefore the only logical approach was primary prevention, preventing nuclear war from happening in the first place. The Red Cross, the world's largest, and Red Crescent, the world's largest humanitarian organisation, has recently reassessed the global capacity to respond to nuclear detonation and essentially come to the same conclusion that that capacity isn't currently available and basically is not feasible. But it's the climate impacts that would likely be, we now understand, of greatest moment in terms of the toll if nuclear weapons were used. How does that work? Nuclear weapons are extraordinarily efficient at igniting simultaneous fires over very large areas. For example, it's estimated that the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima released about 1,000 times as much energy in the fires that it ignited as the explosive power of the weapon itself. A megaton range weapon on a modern city, for example, this one, you're talking about an area of 1,600 square kilometres out to a radius of 23 kilometres. iCity, Cyberjaya would be within range, 800 degrees, consuming most of the oxygen. No living thing would survive within that area. But that would release vast amounts of smoke as the cloth, wood, plastic, paper, petroleum products, waste, chemical storage facilities, vegetation all burned. The scenario that's been repeatedly examined by climate scientists, now extensively peer-reviewed and published, really unassailable science, recognised by the world's governments, was a scenario between India and Pakistan, a war. The reality, the real possibility of which was reinforced starkly to us just 2 months ago, when there was serious risks of armed conflict escalating after the dogfight between the planes and the shooting down of an Indian aircraft. And it's now become clear that nuclear weapons use was seriously considered on both sides. India and Pakistan have been to war 3 times since independence, mobilised for war up to 1 million troops across particularly the disputed border in Kashmir on 2 other occasions. This is not an unrealistic prospect. They both have policies of early employment of nuclear weapons. If, in Pakistan's case, it's invaded, or in India if conflict is clearly escalating. And there are clearly very large numbers of people living in close proximity to that contested border. So the scenario, now more than a decade old when the first work was done, involved 100 Hiroshima-sized weapons. That was then about half their current arsenals. It would of course cause calamitous acute consequences in the region, but it would also produce about 6 million tonnes of smoke. So 50 Hiroshima-sized weapons targeted on cities in each country. And I remind you that this constitutes less than 0.5% of the global nuclear arsenal in terms of weapons numbers, and less than 0.1%, because these are relatively small weapons, of the yield of that arsenal. So by nuclear standards, this is a small war. Some of this work has been recently updated in some studies that are in progress by many of the same people and presented at a major scientific meeting just in December, because Pakistan and India are growing their arsenals faster than any other states on Earth, and now have about 150 weapons, in Pakistan's case 140 in India's case. So the current arsenals and the density of fuel and people in their cities has increased. So the current arsenals are estimated to not produce 6 million tonnes of smoke, but more like 15 million tonnes of smoke. So the scenario that I'll show you is a very understated estimate. So smoke generated by a nuclear conflict in South Asia would pretty rapidly cover most of the inhabited regions of the planet. Within a couple of weeks, it's pretty much everywhere. Looked at in a different way. So this is as if you took a cross-section through the atmosphere. The South Pole here, the equator in the middle, the North Pole here, and this is up in the atmosphere. The troposphere is where our weather happens, where there are clouds and rain and snow, where particulate material gets washed out. Once material gets into the stratosphere and even further in the mesosphere, there's no washout. It only settles very slowly by gravity. So the residence time of material that reaches the stratosphere is much longer. Look what happens to this smoke. It moves fairly quickly. It's hard to see in detail, but this starts on the 1st of January. I'll show it to you once again. Within a matter of days, that smoke is mostly in the stratosphere and the mesosphere, where it stays for very, very long periods and spreads globally. This is a bit complicated, but these different lines are different studies showing what's expected to happen to the smoke. To sunlight, it gets darker. To temperature, it gets colder by about 1.5 degrees. And rainfall reduces by about 30% globally. The most recent and most sophisticated study is this blue one from Mike Mills at the National Centre for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado in the US. But they're very consistent. And in that most recent study, these effects haven't yet returned to baseline for as long as the model was run, 26 years. So these are very protracted effects. Of course, they wouldn't be even. The large land masses of Eurasia and North America, where most of the world's grain is grown, would cool not by 1.5 degrees, but by 5 to 8 degrees. Growing seasons in much of the temperate and subtropical regions of the world would be shorter by around a month. And ultraviolet flux would be dramatically increased by between 3 to 5 levels on the WHO sort of clinical scale of biologically important UV, essentially producing Antarctic ozone hole type conditions over pretty much all of the inhabited globe. This would, of course, have impacts on human health, eyes, skin, immune systems, but it would also drastically reduce plant and animal growth, damage, development, both on land and in water, where the phytoplankton in the upper layers of the ocean at the base of the marine food chain are often already currently UV limited. So what does this do to food production? Colder, darker, drier. Of course, there would be other impacts. The UV increase, really the biggest increase in UV flux since life crawled out of the oceans a very long time ago. There would be areas contaminated by radioactivity and chemicals dispersed in the war. And perhaps most importantly, there would be disruption to the water, fuel, pesticides, seed, fertiliser distribution and management systems that underpin modern global agriculture. These are currently being modelled, but we don't yet have good, robust data on what these effects, how these would magnify the effects. But what we have now very clearly is good evidence on colder, darker, drier for the world's main food crops. So for the major grain crops in the two largest global producers, the US and China, the declines in the first 5 years are 15 to 40%, and in the second 5 years about half that, about 10 to 25%. We're not well positioned to withstand multi-decade declines in food production of that magnitude. FAO estimates there are currently 821 million people who today do not get enough to eat. Global grain stocks are currently actually pretty good, but even at those better reserves than there have been for quite some time, this is about This is less than 4 months' worth of consumption. And in addition to those currently hungry, there are people who get enough to eat today, but are heavily dependent on imported food for more than half their caloric intake, at least 300 million of them. So even very simple estimates make it clear that a significant proportion of the global population, in proportion to their current food insecurity, would be vulnerable to starving in a small regional nuclear war on the other side of the planet. And of course, famines are associated with epidemics of infectious disease and intra and often interstate conflict, which of course would exacerbate the impacts. Let's put this in some kind of perspective. This is the global average surface temperature record of the last 1,000 years, with the warming of about a degree that is causing so much justified concern. The scenario that I've showed you would more than offset that very quickly within a matter of days. If just the weapons that the United States and Russia now have on high alert, ready to be launched within a few minutes, were used in a nuclear war, we would have temperature declines of not 1.5 degrees, but about 5 degrees, which is typical ice age conditions. If all of just the strategic, the long-range nuclear weapons that the US and Russia now have, that they've fully implemented their commitments under the New START agreement, we'd be down twice as cold as that. Conditions that haven't existed for a very long time. And it's very difficult to see humanity surviving rapid, abrupt, persistent global cooling of that magnitude. So some of the key climate scientists involved in generating this work have really drawn the lesson that rather than mutually assured destruction, the theoretical underpinning of the theory of deterrence, psychological construct, the realities of self-assured destruction. If nuclear weapons are used, they will have severe catastrophic effects on those who use them as well as on those who are targeted. So essentially these are global suicide bombs. They simply cannot be used. So how are we tracking in the possibilities for controlling these and for the possibilities of their use? Well, so far most of the trends are not really heading in the right direction. No nuclear armed state is currently disarming, and there are in fact no negotiations underway for the first time in 30 years. Not only that, but the limited, hard-won agreements that have constrained nuclear proliferation over recent decades, the hard-won legacy of the end of the Cold War, are being eroded. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty first, the Iran deal, of course, now, and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, that signature treaty that ushered in the end of the Cold War. Both Russia and, following the United States, have signalled that they will withdraw from this treaty. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is even under threat, even though it hasn't even entered into force yet. Perhaps worse than that, all of the nuclear armed states are not only doing what they're obliged to do and get rid of their weapons, they're actually investing in new weapons, modernising them with new capacities, making them more flexible, more accurate, more usable. Vast sums, over $100 billion US per annum, are invested in this enterprise. In the US, the forward estimates projected over the next 30 years amount to perhaps $1.5 trillion. Extraordinary sums of money. These long-term investments are not the hallmark of serious intent to disarm. We know that there have been many occasions on which nuclear weapons use came so close. Various combinations of human and technical error, both of which won't finish anytime soon, have brought us to the brink. I've just listed some of the best documented. This is clearly a risk. We also know that all of the nuclear armed states have, on occasion, actually planned and threatened to use their nuclear weapons. Daniel Ellsberg, in his remarkable book, The Doomsday Machine, which I would strongly commend to you, documents the 25 known instances when the US threatened nuclear weapon use. And we've seen a level of explicit nuclear threat in multiple spheres, in India, Pakistan, in the Korean Peninsula, between NATO and Russia, and in the Middle East, that we really haven't seen since the Cold War. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the custodians of the doomsday clock, this annually updated, very authoritative and considered assessment on how humanity is tracking against the big existential threats of nuclear weapons and climate change, last year, for the first time since 1953, moved the hands to 2 minutes to midnight. And this year, in January, when they review the clock, left the hands at the same position, mainly related to worsening nuclear dangers, but progress on climate change being pretty limited and not up to the task either. UN Secretary General, in his blueprint for disarmament for his tenure, has used pretty blunt language for the world's most senior diplomat about the danger of the times that we live in, and essentially we're on the brink of a new Cold War. Just yesterday, the United Kingdom House of Lords Select Committee on International Relations issued a report that also signals recognition of the rising nuclear risk and how close we are to a world without constraints on nuclear modernisation, with the risk of nuclear weapons use being as high as it's been since the end of the Cold War. The United States intelligence community drew attention to two trends that concern me the most in terms of the evolving risk. And this is the link, another link with climate change. A climate-stressed world is an increasingly unsafe place to keep nuclear weapons. A climate-stressed world has populations moving, has food and water insecurity at very large scale. And I think we're already seeing the effects of this. This is the number of internationalised armed conflicts globally, the number of armed conflicts that involve a state outside the direct area of conflict. And you'll see that there's been a very sharp increase in the last 8 or so years as the reality of climate disruption, I think, really starts to bite. The other trend that's really concerning, very difficult to govern, is the whole emerging area of cyber warfare. We know that nuclear command and control systems are not isolated, not uniquely protected from this threat. We know that even the computers of the US National Security Agency were extensively hacked in late 2017. We know that many states have already offensively used cyber attack. The US against North Korean and Iranian missiles, Israel and the US against uranium enrichment centrifuges, North Korea against the British health system, Sony Corporation, US banks, Russia against in elections in Europe and the US. This is already part of the reality of our world, and this is also available, opens possibilities for non-state actors to create havoc as well. Another problem we have is the problem of fissile materials, the things that put the nuclear in a nuclear weapon, plutonium and highly enriched uranium. Depending on the size and sophistication, you only need a handful of kilograms of plutonium or about 3 times as much highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. There are enough stockpiles of both of these materials globally to build about 200,000 nuclear weapons. So this cat is out of the bag, and a rules-based order that durably gets rid of nuclear weapons and keeps it that way will need to deal with this issue, and is even more urgent in the context where the capacity to acquire these materials is more widely available. So how are we in relation to disarmament? A very quick overview of the history that gets us to, I think, the present danger and opportunity. It's important, I think, to say at the outset just how deeply embedded in the collective expression of our will for the world we want to live in is the desire for a world free of nuclear weapons. The very first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly in January 1946 called for the elimination of atomic weapons. The obligation to disarm is legally enshrined in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which most states regard as the key international instrument related to nuclear weapons, and which only 4 states globally, all of whom have nuclear weapons, are not party to. It provides a legally binding obligation for states to negotiate disarmament in good faith. And this is an obligation that's not confined to the nuclear-armed states, but to all the states parties. The world's highest legal authority, the International Court of Justice, has determined unanimously that that obligation exists not just to negotiate, but to bring these negotiations to a conclusion, to finish the job, to disarm. We have made very significant progress in controlling the other major classes of inhumane and indiscriminate weapons: biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, all of them subject to a prohibition treaty, which has been crucial in codifying their rejection in an international treaty that provides the same standard for all governments, which is essential for its sustainability, and then provides the basis and motivation for the progressive elimination of those weapons. More or less effectively, 1 step forward, 2 steps back on a couple of these, but we have made very significant progress. All of these weapons are less often produced, deployed, traded, justified now. The stigmatise, prohibit and eliminate pathway has been the lesson of history of what's worked and is working for indiscriminate, inhumane weapons. ICAN was founded, proposed by Dr. Ron McCoy in 2005 in deep frustration about the stagnation and backsliding on nuclear disarmament, but inspired by the extraordinary success of the international campaign to ban landmines, which, despite the opposition of the major users and producers, US, Russia, China, who haven't signed this treaty and opposed it, still haven't signed it, have been profoundly influenced by it. And this treaty and this campaign was really the inspiration for ICAN. So we wanted to establish a campaign coalition with the very clear goal of a treaty process to prohibit and provide for the elimination of nuclear weapons, based not on the political and security arguments, but on their consequences. And happily, this was the right idea at the right time and has grown into a substantial campaign, but that was the principal partner for the governments that negotiated the treaty that we'll get to. But there were a number of things that came together that helped this humanitarian initiative on nuclear weapons take root. One was the unexpected call of former senior US officials, Republicans and Democrats, former secretaries of state and defence, not your archetypal peaceniks, Cold War warriors, most of them, saying we need to get rid of nuclear weapons and the US needs to lead in 2007. In many ways, that created the political space for candidate then President Obama to affirm the aspiration of a world free of nuclear weapons and put that back in the mainstream political agenda in a way that it hadn't been for a long time. Unfortunately, the rhetoric wasn't followed by much effective delivery, but it was important. He chaired the first UN Security Council meeting dedicated to nuclear weapons. That, plus some good internal advocacy, encouraged the leader of the world's largest humanitarian organisation, Jakob Kellenberg, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to call together the diplomatic corps in Geneva just before the 2010 NPT review conference and really make a very significant and strong statement of nuclear weapons elimination as unfinished humanitarian business, a humanitarian imperative that henceforth states could expect to hear much more from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement about, their partner in dealing with emergencies and responding to them. That created the will in a number of states to push very hard for the consensus outcome document in 2010 to refer for the first time to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And that created the political momentum that then allowed Norway, Mexico and Austria in succession in 2013 and 14 to host the first ever intergovernmental meetings dedicated to examining the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. They were attended by 80% of the world's governments, and the conclusions were essentially unchallenged, that any use of nuclear weapons would be an unmitigated catastrophe for which no effective response was possible, that the dangers had been underestimated, and that there was this anomalous legal gap that saw the worst of all weapons, the only weapons of mass destruction, not to be subject to a prohibition treaty. Rapidly, the Austrian government at the end of the meeting stepped up with a commitment to fill that legal gap. And quite rapidly, 127 states joined. There were then, over the period of 2012 to 2015, in every relevant UN and NPT conference, clear statements about the urgent need for disarmament on a humanitarian basis that grew from very small numbers to very large numbers, and clearly some movement was afoot. Of course, the dilemma is that the nuclear-armed states are really not interested in disarming, and the states that don't have nuclear weapons, unfortunately, can't get rid of weapons they don't own. So what can they do? They can't eliminate them, but they could prohibit them. And that process worked through a range of UN mechanisms, open-ended working groups, processes open to all states. Very important in that process was having the evidence clearly presented about the consequences and the impossibility of any response. And I'm really proud that the World Medical Association, the International Council of Nurses, the World Federation of Public Health Associations, the key largest international health professional federations came together with international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war to speak with one voice of this as a planetary health imperative. It was quite influential. So it was clear during this process that the world was heading to negotiating a prohibition instrument. The UN, in the end of 2016, the General Assembly mandated these negotiations with a really very tall order. Negotiate this important new treaty. You've only got 7 months and 4 weeks of actual negotiations to do it. Very ably chaired by Elaine White Gomez, the Costa Rican ambassador in Geneva, who's really an unsung hero. This process was really quite remarkable. The access that civil society had, the ability to present evidence, remind the diplomats of why their work was so important, was there in a way that has never happened before. And most importantly, alongside those facts and data, making it real, connecting with heads and hearts, was the crucial role of the survivors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors of nuclear testing around the world, for whom nuclear weapons are not some abstract geopolitical chess game of parity and balance, but a lived daily reality of suffering and indiscriminate loss and displacement and ill health. They connected in a way that was remarkable. You could hear a pin drop every time they spoke. Enormous courage and authority. Because they were there, this treaty is the first ever disarmament treaty to acknowledge the disproportionate impacts of nuclear weapons on Indigenous people, and by the way also on women and girls who are 40% more susceptible to cancer induction for any given dose of radiation than men and boys. So when it came to the vote, because the 9 nuclear-armed states and the 30-odd states that claim to rely on US nuclear weapons stayed away, the vote was pretty overwhelming. It was really everybody else. It was an extraordinarily historic moment in these usually very formal proceedings in the bowels of the UN in New York. This was the most extraordinary thing I've ever had the privilege to witness. This is the conference president with Setsuko Thurlow, the Hiroshima survivor who went on to co-accept the Nobel Peace Prize for ICAN. For the survivors, it was an extraordinary moment. And this would not have happened without civil society. This would not have happened without the support, particularly mobilised through ICAN. So nuclear weapons are now well on the way to the same stigmatised, internationally illegal footing as those other indiscriminate, inhumane weapons. The treaty will enter into force when 50 states have ratified it. Currently there are 70 signatures and 23 ratifications. Let me give you just a snapshot of the key elements of this instrument. It's not long. I would really commend it to you. It's clearly based on humanitarian evidence, which is eloquently summarised as to why this treaty was negotiated. It does provide a categorical and comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons. Very importantly, it provides a pathway for all states, those with and without nuclear weapons, to fulfil their legal obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. It's the only place where such a pathway is spelled out. It has obligations for victim assistance and environmental remediation that are groundbreaking, and there are no reservations. So states can't pick and choose which elements they'll accept. It's the whole box and dice or nothing. And it really is a very important statement of hope and capacity to deal with this threat. And it's really the only bright spot in an otherwise increasingly bleak world of increasing nuclear dangers. But of course, in a way, the treaty was the easy part. What we crucially need is leadership. We currently do not have it from any of the states that hold all of humanity and all of our good earth to ransom with these heinous weapons. But we can change that. Why does this treaty matter? It matters because it delegitimises nuclear weapons. The other treaties have had profound effects even on states that haven't signed them. Every United Nations meeting I go to, I hear US diplomats, often in the same breath, boast their virtual compliance with the landmines ban, which they opposed and haven't signed, in the same breath as they criticise the nuclear weapons ban treaty. International law, more states joining, adds stigma to the weapons. They're less likely to be produced and used and deployed. They become a badge of shame and not of honour. They change national behaviour. It does provide a pathway for all states, and it's currently the only such pathway. It reinforces and strengthens many other aspects of international law, especially international humanitarian law, the laws of war, and also human rights law. And it's a moment of truth. Are you serious about disarmament, or are you not? One of the most encouraging things for me that gives me comfort that this treaty matters is the level of opposition that it has aroused amongst the nuclear-armed states. This is not some fine verbiage from the United Nations that they can happily ignore, as they often do. This makes a difference. This puts them on notice. Let me give you one example. At the time when the mandate vote for the negotiations was happening, and the public arguments being made were that this would be a distraction, ineffective, that it would increase divisions, that it would undermine the NPT, What was the US saying to its NATO allies in admonishing them not to support these negotiations and if they happened to stay away? It had nothing to do with any of the publicly stated reasons. This treaty was recognised that it would stigmatise nuclear weapons and deterrence. It could impact even non-parties, even before its entry into force. It's inconsistent with NATO's deterrence and nuclear defence posture. It certainly is. States may no longer be able to cooperate to threaten nuclear weapons use. The opposition was because this treaty would work as intended. Recognition of that. There's also a level of opposition about this to this treaty on the part of the nuclear armed and dependent because of the process. This changed the game in a way that I haven't seen before in 40 years of working on this issue. This was an initiative led by the states without the weapons on a clear humanitarian basis with unprecedented involvement of civil society and survivors, and it unblocked the UN. It's the first time the General Assembly has ever negotiated a disarmament treaty, and it was stunningly efficient and effective. It brings the authority of the world's most fundamental and inclusive organ, the General Assembly of the United Nations, to bear on this treaty. It bypassed the requirement for consensus of the NPT and the Conference on Disarmament, where even one state disagreeing means agreement isn't possible, and is the reason why the Conference on Disarmament has not even been able to agree on an agenda for 27 years. And because of that lack of requirement for consensus, the nuclear armed states couldn't stop it. They don't like this treaty for some very good reasons. How do we use this treaty to make a difference to try and accelerate the elimination of nuclear weapons? Moral leadership is really important. We're seeing some from the Red Cross. We're seeing some from faith leaders, Pope Francis being prominent among them. We need more. The Red Cross has called on all states to join this treaty, as has many health organisations, including the World Medical Association. We need them to work for this. If national governments don't do the right thing, there are ways of other levels of government providing pressure and taking the lead. Cities, states, parliaments. A growing number of cities are calling on their national governments to join the treaty. The state of California, both houses did so late last year. Various national parliaments can also provide moral and political leadership. We're already starting to see money move away from nuclear weapons even before this treaty enters into force. A number of banks and pension funds, including the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, the Norwegian pension fund, Europe's largest pension fund, some significant banks, Deutsche Bank, the largest Belgian bank, two public Swedish pension funds, Japanese banks, and others, even before the treaty has entered into force, seeing the writing on the wall that these are stigmatised weapons, that socially responsible financial institutions should not be supporting makers of these weapons. In my country, 4 big banks have $6.5 billion invested in companies that make nuclear weapons. Everybody has a bank account or a pension fund and can take action on this and make sure their money isn't supporting nuclear weapons production. My university, I'm not proud to say, has collaborations with companies that make nuclear weapons, which are now coming under serious scrutiny from both staff and students. The UN Human Rights Commission, after fluffing around for years on this piece of work, a general comment offering authoritative legal guidance on the interpretation of the right to life in a key international human rights instrument, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, after the treaty was adopted, has clearly stated that nuclear weapons are incompatible with respect for the right to life. This embeds this issue in a human rights framework as well. My country was one of the most active opponents of this treaty and was one of the main reasons for the widespread use of the term weasel state around the halls of the UN in 2014, 15 and 16. It's important to note for the states that have military connections with nuclear armed states that that's not incompatible with joining this treaty. More than half of the 17 states that the US designates as major non-NATO allies supported the adoption of this treaty, and 3, all in this region, Thailand, Philippines and New Zealand, have signed this treaty. Thailand and New Zealand have already ratified. Because their military cooperation does not involve preparations for or assistance in use of nuclear weapons, that military cooperation has been unaffected by them being strong supporters of this treaty. Let me turn now to in concluding to the Nobel Prize. IPPNW was awarded this prize in 1985, essentially for speaking to the evidence-based advocacy, informing the public and decision makers about the real costs and consequences of nuclear weapons in a way that had political traction at that time in contributing to the end of the Cold War and the disarmament agreements that accompanied it. ICAN's citation in 2017 is remarkably similar. It's for speaking to the evidence in a way that has had political traction, in this case, in the negotiation and adoption of this historic treaty. It's, of course, extremely welcome. It draws attention to the urgency of this issue in a prominent way that could not have come at a better time. It gives enormous encouragement to the people and governments who work on this issue and who need to continue working on this issue. And it bears tribute to the power of people, to vision, to a plan, to persistence, to working cooperatively. Things happen usually because small groups of people effectively working together decide to make it happen. So I'm delighted to share the Nobel Medal with you today. In a way, our existential dilemma can be summarised in this simple question. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? It will be one of those two things. For everything that we hold dear, for everything that we strive for, we all have a role to play to make absolutely sure that the answer to this question is the right one. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Ruff, for a wonderful presentation. And, this is an amazing opportunity to get to see close up the kind of global issues, and bringing it here at Monash, I think, allows us, like you said, an abstract a topic that we see and read every day, and it's now become closer to us. And of course, the Nobel Prize that most of us will never ever get to see is now also close to us. And so thank you for that. And so I now am going to start the question session. So I invite Professor Ruff to join me at the seat in front, and I will open it to the floor if you have any questions. So while we wait for questions, so maybe I can start. So right now we have the US and Russia, there's this issues about spying, and where there's some friction going on, and there's this also talk about Cold War restarting with Russia. Is there a possibility where Russia may now begin to grow in its nuclear power?
I think essentially this arms race between them it's not set in stone, but it's already a long way down a slippery slope. Both countries have continuing programs of nuclear weapons modernisation. The US produced the first new nuclear warheads for the first time in many years in January this year, within weeks of the notice of withdrawal from the INF treaty. Russia has proposals that are already being implemented for types of nuclear weapons that we've never seen before. Hypersonic delivery vehicles, undersea nuclear-powered drones with megaton range weapons. It could destroy a large area from a harbour. We've not seen these before. So it appears that essentially the unravelling of the constraints that we've seen since the Cold War is well in train, but of course it can be changed. All it requires is leadership. And I think it's very important to recognise that what we constantly hear is that the conditions are not right. We can't disarm now. There's too much international tension. The world's too uncertain. The world's too complex. There are new proliferation dangers, new non-state actor dangers. Now's not the right time. We can't do this now. Now is exactly the right time. It's the more unstable and dangerous and complex the world is, the more urgent it is that nuclear weapons are simply removed from the table, from the bounds of possibility of their use. And I think it's important to reflect that some of the important achievements of the past, the Partial Test Ban Treaty after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the improved communications between the Soviet Union and Russia after many people realised the profound danger posed during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the INF Treaty, the reciprocating unilateral measures that were actually numerically the biggest way that nuclear weapons numbers between Russia and the Soviet Union was reduced, not through binding agreements that were verified, but actually through reciprocating initiatives between particularly Gorbachev and President Bush the elder at times of extreme tension at the height of the Cold War. So the difficult international climate, in fact, makes it urgent, more urgent that disarmament be progressed, not less urgent. So certainly this can, of course, be turned around, but we're not seeing the kind of leadership that would produce that. And nor are we seeing the kind of massive mobilisation of citizens that helped to engender the end of the Cold War when millions of people marched on the streets. So I think it's the role of civil society all over the world in forcing governments to do the right thing. More force is required when leadership is lacking, has an absolutely crucial role.
Yep. Professor Mahendran?
Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. There is an alternate view. The view is that because of the major powers having nuclear weapons, that there's this whole concept of in game theoretic, in game theory that this prisoner's dilemma, that because your opposition has a very strong weapon, that you would not go to war. A classic example is that look at India and Pakistan. I think if Pakistan did not have nuclear war or nuclear weapons, I think India would have gone in. But because both are equally strong, that there's always a hesitation. The same thing with the Cuban crisis. Though they came very close, they backed off because they knew that the ramification was, enormous. So there is a view that because these superpowers have these nuclear weapons, they are more cautious in terms of getting into a war. That's because of this worry that if I use it, the retaliation is going to be enormous. So there is, because of that idea that 60 years we've got relative peace among the bigger players. Just wanted to hear your view.
Of course, that's an argument, and the nuclear armed states are very adept at coming up with justifications for their continued possession of nuclear weapons. If that argument had serious validity, then why should that right be denied to any nation, and shouldn't all nations be nuclear armed? Of course, the reality is that nuclear weapons may have some role in deterring use of nuclear weapons, but at an extraordinarily fragile, precarious and dangerous way. And we know that most often it's not been deliberate decision but sheer luck that has resulted in us not having had a nuclear war to date. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though neither Kennedy nor Gorbachev wanted nuclear escalation, their brinkmanship that they set in train led to a number of ways. There were 5 different ways during the Cuban Missile Crisis that nuclear war could have started that nobody fully grasped at the time. It was extraordinary that the world managed to get through that without a nuclear war erupting. Combinations of human and technical error are inevitable, and when the consequences are so existentially threatening, the possibility of use of nuclear weapons simply is not survivable. And the idea of rationality around such instruments of destruction loses any cogency when we know that rationality has not guided what's happened with nuclear weapons in the past. Strategic and military balance was not possible to achieve during the Cold War, when it was the United States and Soviet Union. How much more difficult would it be to achieve now in a much more connected and complex and unstable world with possibilities for proliferation that abound? Why do nations not claim? No nation now boasts of possessing biological weapons. No nation argues that smallpox or polio or hemorrhagic fever viruses are required for national defence or deterrence or just in case. No nation argues that sarin nerve gas should be used for deterrence. Yet we accept that argument for weapons which are much worse, which are the only weapons that pose an existential threat. I think such arguments are essentially divorced from a factual appreciation of the consequences of their use and the real dangers that we confront. And yes, there may be some safety, in a sense, in nuclear deterrence, but then we would be much better for those weapons to be abolished. And the feasibility of that has really been established. Nuclear weapons numbers have been reduced by over 80%. Some of that was through the effective implementation of verified agreements, the INF Treaty, the START Treaty. We know how to do this.
Professor Pervez?
Thank you very much, Professor Ruff. It was a very interesting detour in the catastrophic consequences of actually even following nuclear weapons proliferation. My real sort of question and worry is that, as you said, it's about the realization of the consequences, the catastrophe that comes from these. But we are living currently in a world where we have many spin doctors which actually question evidence. We have evidence question about climate change, for example. When we have this level of fake news, what is your opinion on the chances of actually even us succeeding in this question where you said, is it the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? With so much fake news, it looks as if the end of us is more of a possibility than we think it would be if we were optimistic. I'd just like to have your view on it.
Thank you. These are thoughtful and difficult questions. Of course, the era of misinformation, the manipulation of information as a key tool for social control by vested interests of various sorts is a huge global challenge. The lack of respect for evidence that we're seeing at a frightening scale when in a complex world where people are frightened and uncertain and look for answers often too easy or too simplistic. But I think, Martin Luther King said the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. There is no guarantee that we will come up with the right answer to that question. No guarantees whatsoever, which makes it so urgent that we simply remove nuclear weapons from the possibility of being used. And I don't think the fundamental question is not about probabilities, it's about doing what one can to contribute to the right answer to that question. I think the extent to which people around the world these days appreciate the significance that the climate is changing and why it is changing, despite the enormous misinformation fomented by vested interests and deliberate political manipulation, and is quite heartening. I think the movement of young people that we've seen recently, the most tech-savvy generation, the most socially connected via online media, in pushing for gun control in the US, in pushing for action on climate change globally in recent months, gives me enormous encouragement. There are clearly multiple sides to the way technology is used, and the power of the internet and communications these days in a way has been crucial, maybe not crucial, but very helpful to an international campaign like ICAN, which allows really rapid, real-time global communications and responses. Can, of course, also be misused. But I think we all have a responsibility to act in the ways that are available to us to counter such misinformation. And I think universities, speaking in this context, have a really important role, both staff and students, to really make sure that the public engagement, not only that they fulfil their educational responsibilities to the students at their institution, but that the wider role of universities as a collective cultural resource of knowledge and evidence and engaging with important public policy questions is a really important role for universities.
Yeah, there's one.
North Korea has been under international pressure to denuclearize for several decades, several years, but until now they have yet to budge. And part of the reason why is because they are afraid that the US will actually invade the country should they not have nuclear weapons. And it is probably impossible to get the region to denuclearize, like South Korea, to remove their nuclear weapons. So what do you think is the best solution to solve the regional issue in Korea?
Another simple question. Of course, every country needs to denuclearise. Let me just sort of outline a couple of principles as well as sort of reflect a little on the history. I mean, there are lots of reasons why North Korea has developed nuclear weapons, but I firmly believe that it's possible for them to be dismantled and for Northeast Asia, as for the whole world, to become nuclear weapons free. I wouldn't be here otherwise. It's a complex situation. What the North Korean situation does highlight is that inconsistency, double standards, won't wash. Some states uniquely claiming the right to possess nuclear weapons while denying that right to all others is an unsustainable strategy. The most powerful driver of proliferation is the possession of nuclear weapons by another state, by any state. particularly in the context where the means to build nuclear weapons and the ability to acquire fissile materials is within the capacity of any government. North Korea was one of the most technically backward, isolated nations on earth, using a cadre of engineers educated in Russia in the 1950s and a publicly available British Magnox reactor design was able to build nuclear weapons. It shows that anybody can build nuclear weapons. So it makes the need for a rules-based order that provides the same standard, the same rules for everybody, is absolutely crucial. A nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. North Korea has a relatively small number, but the focus on North Korea is largely by, this really exclusive almost focus on the North Korean situation and the Iranian situation. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. We can be very confident about that. Is in a sense a distraction and a diversion, deliberately so in many cases, from the fact that 93% of the world's nuclear weapons reside in the United States and Russia. And the problem is not the custodianship of the weapons. The problem is the weapons themselves.
Maud.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very frightening, actually, but at the same time sobering. And I think there's a glimmer of hope, perhaps. I mean, sometimes we have to be optimistic and hope against all hope, because that's what keeps us going. I have just two questions. One is a simple one. Can you please remind us why women and girls are more susceptible to the effects of nuclear war and radioactivity? I'm sorry, I just introduced myself. Maud Phipps, the Jeffrey Chair School of Medicine. I teach here and I'm a human geneticist. So that's my first question. Could you remind us? And the second question really is, what do you think is being done to actually encourage the younger generation, our children, to actually get involved in this? Because, I mean, the adults can keep on speaking till the cows come home, and there will be those who are, you can't teach, there's this saying, you cannot teach this old dog's new tricks. And a lot of people are so hell-bent on when you get older, it's very, very difficult to change one's opinions. What is your organization, or what is being done to actually educate the young and mobilize the young to actually get involved with what ICAN is doing, to get involved with the reduction of nuclear weapons and banning nuclear weapons? I would be very happy if you could share that with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In relation to women and girls, there are, I think, two aspects. One is that for biological reasons that are not particularly well defined, the same dose of radiation at the same age to a girl leads to a roughly 40% overall lifetime risk of cancer, higher than a male counterpart. Only a small part of that difference is related to the difference in anatomy between males and females. Most of it is related to the female sex. So, but it's not, the precise molecular mechanisms, the genetic basis for that is to my knowledge at least not clearly defined, but it's very clear from particularly the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivor data. And the second aspect of that is that in any conflict or disaster situation, it's actually women and children who are disproportionately disadvantaged, who have the least access to assistance and resources, who are most adversely affected by loss of infrastructure and social services. So there's a twofold aspect to that vulnerability, as well as to their still social disadvantage in many parts of the world. The second question in relation to young people, we thought it was really important when we established ICAN to involve young people. Two of the most common sort of criticisms or challenges that I think the movement for peace and nuclear disarmament has faced over the decades were making this engage young people and making this engage people across the globe. When I first began working for nuclear disarmament a long time ago, before this evidence about the global impacts in terms of nuclear winter and nuclear famine was properly understood, I remember personally people from developing countries, Africa in particular, I remember a couple of African colleagues expressing the view that, you know, if the nuclear armed countries are so stupid as to blow themselves up with nuclear weapons, that's their problem. It's not ours. We've got other things much more immediate and urgent in our daily lives to worry about. Of course, that's based on misinformation, but that's not the case anymore. And making ICAN, really trying to use it to push education and to engage young people had many aspects, but particularly employing young people made a big difference. Most of the ICAN staff globally are under 30, certainly under 35. So young people working with other young people works best. And I'm happy to say that the campaign is really very global. And that sort of, this is not an issue for us. I don't hear that anymore around the globe. So I think that knowledge of that actually shared vulnerability, that this is an issue for all of us. We need to take it personally wherever we live. We're threatened by those weapons wherever we live, whoever we are, in whichever country, is really important. And it's important to have linkages in campaigns across generations and have experience and wisdom and diverse perspectives, and young and old and men and women. And ICAN has really tried to embrace that, and I think we've done that reasonably well. At all of these key negotiating meetings and the UN meetings that led to them, where we were able to have several hundred campaigners present from all over the world, working very effectively in a very coordinated and professional way, working with their governments and in their regions. Most of those, certainly not all of them, but most of them were young. A campaign coalition like ICAN depends very much on its partner organisations. It has limited capacity. What it seeks to do is to, through coordinating the efforts of multiple different organisations, to bring very much more value than what it adds simply in terms of capacity and its own staff and people. But helping churches, trade unions, political parties, environment organisations, human rights, international justice and development organisations work together in a coordinated way, that even if they're not established primarily, if this is not their main reason for being, but being able to engage them in having convinced them that this should be part of their work, I think is the key. So many of those, but not all, have prominently involved young people. And working through universities is, of course, a very obvious way to try and engage young people. And I think it's really crucial to do that. And I'm so heartened by the way that the climate movement has been able to do that. People around the world, even if it's not something that brings millions of people out on the streets marching, people understand the problem of nuclear weapons. It's not front of centre in terms of the media and political discourse generally, but around the world we know that opinion poll data is very clear that generally over 75, often over 80, in many European countries over 95% of the population want to get rid of nuclear weapons, want their countries to join the treaty. even in Australia, where the government is constantly canning the treaty, a growing proportion, now 80% of the population, want Australia to join the treaty, as we've joined every other treaty that prohibits an indiscriminate inhumane weapon. So Sue Coleman Haselden, whose photo I showed there, one of the Indigenous elders who was displaced as a 2-year-old by the British nuclear tests in South Australia, often finishes her talks with a saying that really resonates with me as a grandfather now. That the future forever belongs to the next generation. And I think it's absolutely crucial, as you've highlighted, to engage young people, and for those of us who are no longer in that category, to do what we can to that end. Thank you.
There's one at the back.
Thank you, Professor, particularly in your efforts to make TPNW a reality now. And my question is, and I'm tunneling from Sogagagai, Malaysia. And my question is that now the TPNW has been signed and we need 50 states to ratify it in order for it to become a legally binding instrument. So what do you think, Professor, in your opinion, in our local context in Malaysia, that the civil society or maybe people at large can do, perhaps working with ICAN or IPPNW to ensure that our government ratified this treaty which we have signed? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Malaysia has been a leader in nuclear disarmament. Malaysia was, with Costa Rica, were the two governments that first tabled the Model Nuclear Weapons Convention that we produced in the UN and in the NPT review conferences. ASEAN as a whole, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has been really a strong voice, and through all of the process that got to the treaty was actually the regional grouping that was most united. The pressure from the nuclear-armed states, which was fierce and relentless, political, diplomatic, aid, trade, pressure, to try to thwart this treaty's development and governments joining it, peeled off states who would normally have been supportive in every region, but not in this region until the very last moment, until the night before the vote on the adoption of the treaty. It was clearly pressure in capitals from the US that peeled Singapore off regional ASEAN solidarity for the first time. And it's the only ASEAN state not to have signed the treaty. Malaysia, commendably, was one of the 50 states who signed the treaty on the first day that it opened for signature at the UN in New York on the 20th of September 2017, even though I hear encouraging noises that the Malaysian government is working towards ratification of the treaty and that this should happen soon. It hasn't happened yet. I think an obvious thing that Malaysia could and should do, entirely consistent with its policy and its proud history on this, is to ratify the treaty as soon as possible, and then to implement effective domestic legislation to give force in domestic law to the obligations for the treaty, under the treaty, including criminalising any involvement in nuclear weapons activities for anybody subject to the jurisdiction of Malaysian law. So I think that is an area where, of course, it's always useful for citizens' pressure to encourage governments to do the right thing and to do so as quickly as possible. I think another area that could be explored is the area of divestment. I don't know whether there are financial institutions, pension funds, banks in Malaysia that invest in companies that make nuclear weapons, but if they do, they need to hear from you, and people moving their money away from such institutions if they won't do the right thing and divest is, I think, really fertile ground for citizen engagement that everybody can do. You don't need to understand the intricacies of disarmament negotiations to know that you don't want your money supporting making profit from the worst of all weapons. So I think that that's an obvious area for civil society to work on. I think international leadership, making this an active part of Malaysian diplomacy. One of the obligations in the treaty for states parties is that they actually work for the universalisation of the treaty. So I think Malaysia then actively making promotion of the treaty, the reasons why you joined, why you consider it important, discussing the reasons why the treaty was negotiated with nuclear armed and nuclear dependent states, embarrassing the Australian government, please. All of those things would be very useful contributions. Thank you.
All right, so maybe one last question. We have about 2 minutes before we close.
Thank you again for your lecture. And I'd like to resonate with a question earlier with, because you mentioned previously in one of your lecture series that you've had in University of Washington that you were confident that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons can be fully ratified by this year. How confident are you with that statement today onwards?
Okay, I haven't said that recently. I'm not sure I ever said that, but anyway, I would love it to be ratified tomorrow, of course, to enter into force tomorrow. Realistically, I think it would certainly still be possible this year, but more realistically, I would expect next year. I'd be pretty confident about next year, hopefully the first half of the year. Ratifying treaties, of course, takes time. There are constitutionally defined processes. They often involve significant legal, interdepartmental, parliamentary reviews and processes that are often interfered with or delayed because of elections or changes of government. So these things take time. I understand that. But there are many states. On the basis of the meetings that ICAN staff and members have had, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia Pacific, which are the regions basically that will get this treaty over the line, that there are many states that are working on ratification later this year. All of the 34 states of the Central American and Latin American community, except for Argentina, have signed the treaty, and the largest number of ratifications so far is from Latina. In Africa is where we're most deficient in terms of the 54 member states of the Pelindaba Treaty should all be signing this treaty. 12 African states were peeled off from supporting this treaty in the vote. So they're also the countries globally that are most vulnerable probably to nuclear armed state pressure. But we should be seeing 35, 40 African states ratify this treaty soon. South Africa's ratification quite recently, I think, is very important as really a moral and political leader in the continent. In ASEAN too, there's more work to do. All of the states have signed bar Singapore, but only Thailand and Vietnam have so far ratified. So accelerating those processes, pushing from a citizen level would be very helpful. But I'd be hopeful for this year, but I'd be pretty confident about next year. And just let me add that this is not unusual for treaties. The ratifications of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons are actually faster than for any other multilateral nuclear disarmament treaty. They're faster than the NPT ratifications or the CTBT ratifications. So this is not unusual, but I always want it to be quicker.
All right, so we are short of time, so we have to finish today's lecture. But before we finish, I'd like to invite Professor Mahendran Nair, our Vice President of Research and Development, to present a souvenir to Professor Ruff.